Hey everyone, imagine you spent millions on a policy and it didn't work. Now what? Should you fix it or should you scrap it? One of the biggest gaps in my overview of public policy portal video was an absence of anything on policy evaluation. And so in this video, I wanted to rectify that by doing a video on logic models and how they're used in policy evaluation. Policy evaluation is how you answer that question of whether you should fix it or you should scrap it. So in this video, I'm going to go over what they are, how they're used, and the difference between linear and non-linear logic models. So let's dive right in. Logic models are structured tools that help policymakers and evaluators make sense of how a policy is supposed to work, from the resources it uses to the action it takes to the results it achieves. At their core, logic models are a roadmap looking at the logical flow from inputs, so funding and staff, to actions like workshops or services, to outputs, the immediate product of those activities, and finally to outcomes and impacts, which are the changes the policy is hoping to bring about. By making these assumptions explicit in a logic model, it helps clarify the goals, improve planning, and guide evaluation. In policy evaluation, logic models are foundational for figuring out what to measure, when to measure it, and why the measurement matters. By clearly linking a policy's activities to intended outcomes, evaluators can assess whether each step in the chain is actually happening, and whether the final impacts can actually be attributed back to the policy. For example, if a jobs training program isn't improving employment rates, a logic model can help pinpoint where things might be breaking down. Was there enough funding? Were the right skills being taught? Were employers hiring the graduates? Did they hire the graduates but just use them to replace other employees? Logic models make it easier to design meaningful indicators, ask targeted evaluation questions, and avoid jumping to conclusions about success or failure. Let's now look at one of the most basic linear logic models. First, we start with looking at inputs. These are the foundational resources of the policy. So if we're talking about spending, that would be the number of dollars. Or if we're talking about regulation, it would be the rule, and so on. Throughout this, I'll use the example of an electric vehicle subsidy. So the dollars for the subsidy are the inputs in that case. These inputs lead to activities. This is what's actually done with the input. So if the policy is spending, the activity is whatever you're buying. For instance, the purchase of new military equipment. Or if we're talking about taxation, it would be the actual collection of tax dollars after the input of announcing the tax. In our example of EVs, it would be the actual purchase of the EV and receipt of the subsidy by the consumer. Once we know the activities, we move on to the outputs. The outputs are the immediate impacts of the activities. So for instance, it could be the number of families that receive access to a doctor, or the number of jobs created, or the tax revenue generated. It is the very short-term immediate result of the activities. In our example, that would be the total number of EVs sold as a result of the subsidy. Often you would compare it to the situation before the subsidy, so something like EV sales went up 50% compared to last year. Outputs lead to certain outcomes, which can be short, medium, or long-term, and are more closely connected to behavioral or systemic change. For instance, for a new regulation requiring nutritional labeling, an outcome could be lower blood pressure in the population. In our example, more EVs could lead to fewer greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Outputs are what you deliver, outcomes are what changes as a result, although the line between outputs and short-term outcomes is often blurry. Finally, the outcomes lead to impacts. These are the long-term fundamental changes to the issue. If we continue the electric vehicle example, this would be a reduction in the effects of climate change, or potentially just motivating other countries to increase their progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Another example is a policy that limits smoking in public places could have the impact of less lung cancer and an overall healthier population. Now, this is one of the more basic linear logic models. Some will cut out the inputs and the activities and solely focus on the outputs to outcomes to impacts. Others will focus more on immediate outputs to focus on measurable results. These are more often used in performance management. But still others will add more details in the outcome stages by looking at different short, medium, and long-term outcomes. So to quickly recap, inputs lead to activities, lead to outputs, lead to outcomes, lead to impacts. That's your basic logic chain. But what if policies don't follow a straight path? Well, that's where nonlinear logic models come in. These models recognize that policy effects are often messy, emergent, and shaped by feedback loops, power dynamics, and unintended consequences. These could look circular or flowchart-like, and are often built on different preconditions, risks, and external factors. These are often used in more complex environments, or when there are overlapping systems. Think of a wicked problem. By wicked problem, I mean one that is messy, like healthcare or education, where causes and effects are tangled, and there's no single solution. With nonlinear models, the focus isn't just on did the policy work, but it's more about understanding how change happened and what we can learn from it, and asking whether the policy contributed to positive change. And did it do so in a plausible and evidence-supported way? Their strengths are flexibility, realism, and systems thinking. Their weaknesses, they can be vague, hard to measure, and difficult to communicate. That's why oftentimes policy evaluators will use both. For example, they may start with a linear logic model to map assumptions, but overlay a systems map to capture external influences and feedback loops. This helps balance the strengths and weaknesses of each type of logic model and balance clarity with complexity. Earlier in the policy cycle, like during problem definition or policy formulation, we're often working with a broader theory of change, which outlines how we believe a policy will lead to our desired results. The logic model builds on that by turning it into a structured format that helps with planning, implementation, and eventually evaluation. Policy evaluation then uses the full logic model to test whether the linkages between each step actually held up in practice, or to identify where things broke down. In other words, it's a way to see if the assumptions we made before implementation turned out to be accurate. Let's say a policy isn't working. Maybe the activities aren't leading to the outputs, or maybe they are, but the outputs aren't leading to the outcomes we expected. Policy evaluation works to figure that out. And answering that question can be useful for helping us decide if we want to fix it or scrap it. One of the strengths of logic models is that they help us create indicators, specific measurable signs that tell us whether each part of the logic model is working as expected. These indicators become the building blocks of any evaluation. For example, an indicator of our EV subsidy might be the percentage of new car sales that are EVs, or even just the total number of EV sales, say in the 6 months after the implementation of the subsidy. If the policy was expected to increase sales by 20%, but there's only a 10% increase, that's an easy way to see that the policy didn't have the intended result. And then decide to fix those issues, be okay with just a 10% increase, or scrap the policy altogether. Of course, logic models aren't magic. They can oversimplify messy reality and give a false sense of control. But used thoughtfully, they're a powerful tool for learning. Common problems include confusing outputs with outcomes. So something like how many people heard the message that there was a hurricane coming versus the outcome of how many people actually sought appropriate shelter. Linear models can lead to an overconfidence in linear causality, especially if you're using only a linear logic model. And these models can often ignore external factors that might have a big impact on the outcomes outside of the factors looked at in the logic model. So in the end, a good logic model doesn't guarantee success, but it gives you a map to figure out where things went right or wrong. If we don't evaluate policies effectively, we can't improve them. So when you look at a policy next time, ask yourself, how could a logic model help us make this policy better. Hopefully you now understand how logic models are useful for evaluating policies, and that it's not just a question of did the policy work, but tracing it through each step in the logic model to figure out where things went right and wrong. But that's it for me today. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.